The most dangerous man in any room is not the loudest one. It's the one who has convinced himself that everything he is destroying, he can replace. Memphis, Tennessee, a city that knows something about extremes. A city that gave the world the blues and the king of rock and roll, that sits on the banks of the Mississippi like a man who has seen too much and survived most of it, that holds its contradictions, beauty and grit, grace and grief, with the particular dignity of a place that has never had the luxury of pretending. Memphis doesn't pretend. And that is exactly why it is the right city for this story. Because this is a story about a man who spent the best years of his life pretending, and the woman who spent those same years becoming everything he was too blind to see coming. His name was Jack Brooks. And on the morning this story begins, Jack Brooks was, by every visible measure, a man who had won. 41 years old. Corner office on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown. The kind of office where the window is the whole wall, and the city below looks like a model someone built to impress you. A company climbing every metric that mattered. A name that opened doors in Memphis boardrooms the way a master key opens locks. Smoothly, automatically, without resistance. A car that cost more than most people's annual salary. And a suit that fit with the kind of precision that announces, quietly but unmistakably, that the person wearing it believes their time is worth more than yours. Jack Brooks had built all of it. From a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, from a father who worked the docks and a mother who cleaned offices in the buildings where men like Jack eventually worked, he had climbed with ferocity that was almost beautiful in its single-mindedness. Almost. Because there is a version of ambition that builds and a version that burns, and Jack Brooks, at 41 years old on a Tuesday morning in Memphis, was standing at the precise and invisible line between the two, and he didn't even know it. Downstairs, in a house in East Memphis with good bones and a garden that needed more attention than it was getting, his wife Maria was feeding their 18-month-old son Oliver and trying to remember the last time Jack had been home before 9 o'clock at night. She was 34 years old, dark-eyed and quietly brilliant, the kind of woman whose depth announces itself not loudly but gradually. The more time you spent with her, the more you realized how much was there. She had paused her own ambitions to build their life together, trusting that the partnership was real, that the sacrifice was shared, that the man she married was still in there somewhere behind the quarterly reports and the conference calls and the late-night strategy sessions it had, somewhere in the last 2 years, stopped being exceptions and started being the entire architecture of their life. She fed Oliver his breakfast. She kissed his forehead. She waited. She was very, very good at waiting. And she was running out of a particular kind of patience that asks nothing in return. Jack, that Tuesday morning, was not thinking about Maria. He was thinking about the offer. The promotion, if you could call it that, because it was less a promotion and more a reinvention, a complete restructuring of his professional trajectory, the kind of opportunity that arrives once in a career and expect an answer immediately. New city, new title, new altitude. And it came, as these things so often do, wrapped in something else. Someone else. Her name doesn't matter now. What matters is that she represented, in Jack's mind, everything the version of himself he was running toward would have. Freedom from the way of family he loved in theory, but couldn't seem to show up for in practice. Freedom from the guilt that lived in the corners of his house, like a draft he couldn't find the source of. Freedom from a version of himself who came home late and held his son for 10 minutes and told himself that was enough. She wasn't freedom. She was an escape route. There is a difference. And Jack didn't know it yet. He took the offer. He started the affair. He told Maria it was over in a conversation so insufficient for the gravity of what he was dismantling that she stood in their kitchen afterward and stared at the wall for a long time. Not crying, not yet. Just staring, the way you stare when something has happened that your mind needs a moment to fully accept as real. Oliver was asleep upstairs. The house was very quiet. And Maria Brooks, who would later be known by a different name entirely, a name she would earn in ways Jack could never have predicted, stood in that kitchen and made a decision so quiet and so complete that she barely recognized it as a decision at all. She was not going to break. She was going to build. But Jack didn't see that. Jack was already gone. The early years of his new life delivered exactly what he had traded his family to obtain. The promotion was real. The money was real. The influence was real. Memphis watched Jack Brooks ascend with the particular appreciation the city has for one of its own who climbs, and Jack took that appreciation and ran with it. Further, faster, higher. He acquired the things that ambitious men acquire when they are moving too fast to ask themselves whether acquisition is the same as happiness. A penthouse apartment, memberships, connections that felt like friendships until the moment they needed to cost something, and then revealed themselves as what they actually were. The affair ran its natural course and ended the way affairs end, not in drama, but in the quiet mutual recognition that the thing that seemed significant in its transgression turns out to be fairly ordinary once the transgression becomes a norm. She left. He was not devastated. That, in its own way, told him something he chose not to hear. The promotions plateaued. The company his company. The empire he'd built and the one he'd joined on the way up went through a particular reshuffling that companies go through when the market shifts and the leadership class has been stable long enough to calcify. New faces arrived. Younger, hungrier, cheaper, and carrying none of the accumulated entitlements that come with years of being told you are exceptional. Jack watched his sphere of influence contract the way a tide pulls back. Gradually at first, barely perceptibly, and then all at once. The calls came less frequently. The invitations redistributed themselves to newer names. And Jack Brooks, who had organized his entire identity around the forward momentum of professional ascent, found himself on a Tuesday evening sitting at his apartment desk with a whiskey he hadn't touched and a view of the Memphis skyline that used to feel like a reward and now felt like a reminder. He thought about Oliver. He thought about this with the specific, uncomfortable frequency of a man who knows he has done something that cannot be categorized as anything other than wrong, and who has developed an elaborate internal architecture to avoid fully inhabiting that knowledge. Oliver would be, he calculated, 9 years old now, maybe 10. Jack was not certain of the exact date, and the not certainty was its own verdict. He knew vaguely that Maria had gone back to school. Someone had mentioned it at a dinner party. Oh, your ex-wife. Isn't she studying medicine or something? And Jack had nodded in the way of a man who, if pretending this information, is not simultaneously impressive and indicting. Medicine. Maria. He turned that over in his mind the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look under. And then he poured the whiskey down the sink and went to bed. The symptoms started small, the way serious things often start. Quietly, plausibly, easily dismissed as the accumulated wear of a stressful life. Fatigue that sleep didn't fix. A weight loss he attributed to finally taking his health seriously, until the numbers kept moving in a direction that didn't match his narrative. Headaches that arrived with regularity and intensity that eventually graduated from concerning to impossible to ignore. Jack Brooks, who had spent 20 years believing that his body, like everything else in his life, would respond to the force of his will, found himself sitting across a desk from a specialist who was using words like rare and aggressive and limited treatment options with the careful, practiced neutrality of a physician delivering news that will change the shape of a person's life in the space of a single sentence. Rare. The word landed and stayed. A disease affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans. The kind of diagnosis that doesn't have a standard protocol, doesn't have a well-worn treatment path, doesn't have the reassurance of millions of case studies and refined interventions. The kind of diagnosis that requires a specialist. The kind of specialist that, in Memphis, Tennessee, happened to work out a university hospital, one of the city's premier medical centers, the place where the most complex and most hopeless cases were sent when other institutions had reached the edge of their competence. Jack's physician said the name of the hospital the way you say the name of a last resort when you're trying to make it sound like a plan. Jack sat in his apartment that night, the whiskey untouched again, the city lights doing their indifferent glittering through the window, and understood, with a clarity that only mortal fear can produce, what he had made of his life. No partner, no child in the next room, no person in his contacts list whom he could call at 11 o'clock at night and say, "I'm scared, I need you," not one, not a single one. Because he had spent 15 years building a network and neglecting a family, and networks, it turns out, do not sit with you in hospital waiting rooms. Connections are not the same as people who love you. He had chosen, at every fork in the road, the thing that looked like power over the thing that felt like home. And now, At 50 years old in a city full of people who had once known his name, Jack Brooks had never been more completely alone. The ambulance that took him to University Hospital 3 weeks later, after a collapse at his desk that he could not dismiss or defer or reframe into anything other than what it was, moved through Memphis streets that Jack had driven 1,000 times in better circumstances. He watched the city through the small smudged window in the back of the vehicle and thought about all of it. The choices, the trade-offs, the morning in the kitchen when Maria had stood very still and stared at the wall and said nothing. He thought about Oliver, 10 years old, maybe 11, growing up in the shape of his absence. He thought about the specialist's word, rare. He thought about how ironic it was, or maybe it was exactly fitting. Maybe the universe had a more precise sense of proportion than he'd given it credit for, that the man who had spent his entire life believing he was exceptional had ended up with an exceptional disease. Rare in all the wrong ways. For all the wrong reasons. University Hospital received him. The monitors were attached. The fluorescent lights hummed above him with the democratic indifference of medical settings that have seen every kind of human condition and treat them all with equal clinical attention. Jack stared at the ceiling and waited for whoever was coming to tell him what came next. He was terrified. He was exhausted. And somewhere beneath both of those things, buried under 15 years of pride and performance and the relentless forward motion of a man who never stopped long enough to reckon with what he left behind. He was, for the first time in longer than he could remember, willing to be honest. He had nothing left to protect, no image to maintain, no narrative to manage. He was just a sick man in a hospital bed in Memphis, waiting for a doctor whose name he didn't yet know. He didn't know yet that the name would stop him cold. He didn't know yet that the most qualified physician in the city for exactly this kind of case had been built, piece by painstaking piece, out of everything he had destroyed. He didn't know that the hands most capable of saving his life were the same hands he had once left behind without a second glance, in a kitchen that went very quiet, in a house that deserved so much better than what he gave it. But here's the question that should already be sitting with you, the one that this story is really asking beneath all the ambition and the illness in the Memphis skyline. When the person you wrong most becomes the only person who can save you, does their choice to help you say something about who they are, or does it say something about who you fail to become? While Jack Brooks was busy building an empire he couldn't take with him, Maria Brooks was building something he could never buy back. Hold that thought, because before we get to hospital room, before we get to the moment that will rewrite everything both of them thought they knew about consequence and grace, you need to understand what Maria did with the wreckage Jack left behind. Not the summary of it, not the headline version. You need to feel the actual weight of what she carried and what she chose to do with it, because without that understanding, what happens next is just a story. With it, it becomes something you will carry around for a long time after the screen goes dark. The morning after Jack left, Maria woke up at 5:45, not because she had slept and the alarm pulled her out, because she hadn't slept at all, and at some point the night had simply become morning, the way it does when your mind refuses to stop processing something it cannot yet accept. Oliver was in the next room, 18 months old, entirely unaware that the architecture of his life had just shifted in ways he wouldn't understand for years. Maria lay in the quiet and listened to him breathe through the baby monitor, and she made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that gets announced or recorded or witnessed. Just a quiet, cellular, absolute decision. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than thought. She was not going to let this be the thing that defined them. Oliver would not grow up in the shadow of his father's abandonment. He would grow up in the light of everything his mother was about to become. She just didn't know yet exactly what that was going to cost. The first year was the hardest in the specific way that first years after catastrophic loss are always hardest, not because of singular dramatic moments, but because of the relentless accumulation of ordinary moments that should have been shared and weren't. The empty chair at dinner, the bedtime routine she did alone, every night, without variation or relief. The parent-teacher forum that asked for 2 emergency contacts, and she stared at the second line for a long time before writing her sister's name. She worked double shifts at the hospital administrative office, where she'd taken a job that paid enough to keep the lights on and the refrigerator full, and she came home smelling of fluorescent lighting and institutional coffee. And she picked up Oliver and held him for 10 minutes before starting the evening routine, and somewhere in those 10 minutes every night, she found what she needed to keep going. He was not a burden. He was a reason. There's a difference, and Maria knew it in her bones. She enrolled in her first pre-med courses at a community college on a Tuesday night in October. Sitting in a classroom full of students a decade younger than her, with a backpack she bought at a discount store and a determination so concentrated it was almost visible. Her professor, a tired, meticulous man who had seen 100 adult returning students drift in and out of ambition, noticed her in the third week, because she was the only one who came to his office hours twice and asked questions that went past the syllabus. He told her later, at her graduation, that he knew that first semester she was going to finish. He said the look in her eyes wasn't hope. It was certainly dressed as hunger. But here is what the inspirational version of this story would skip over. And this story is not going to skip over it, because the truth of what Maria built matters more than the comfort of a clean narrative. There was a semester, Oliver 4 years old, and Maria midway through her undergraduate coursework, where the rent and the tuition and the childcare and the groceries all arrived at the same moment with insufficient funds to meet all of them. She made the calculation that parents in impossible positions make, quietly and without complaint, and she called in every favor she had, and she and Oliver spent 11 weeks sleeping on the fold-out couch in her colleague Denise's apartment in Midtown, Oliver thinking it was an adventure, Maria grading flashcards at the kitchen table at midnight, while Denise's household slept around her. 11 weeks. She never missed a class. She never missed a shift. She never let Oliver see anything other than the steady, warm, completely intentional version of a mother who had decided that instability was a condition to move through, not a verdict to accept. Ask yourself this: where does that kind of strength come from? Not from circumstance, not from advantage. It comes from deciding, in the full knowledge of how hard it is going to be, that the alternative is unacceptable. That is what Maria Brooks decided. Every single day. For years, she earned her undergraduate degree. She applied to medical school and was rejected the first time and reapplied and was accepted. And she sat in her car in the parking lot of Oliver's elementary school and read the acceptance letter 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it was real. And then she drove home and made Oliver's favorite dinner and didn't tell him why they were celebrating, just that they were. She was going to be a doctor, not because the path was clear. It was the furthest thing from clear, but because her mother had died fighting an illness that better care might have managed differently, because she had spent 2 years in hospital administration watching patients with rare and complex conditions fall through the cracks of an overwhelmed system, because somewhere in the specific intersection of her grief and her intelligence and her absolute refusal to be defeated, she had found a calling so precise it felt, almost like it had always been there, waiting for her to be ready to answer it. Medical school with a child is not a story medicine schools tell at recruitment events. It is a story of logistics so complex they require the organizational capacity of a military operation applied to the most intimate and exhausting details of daily life. Oliver's school pickups coordinated around clinical rotations, study sessions that began after his bedtime and ran until 2 in the morning, a social life reduced to near zero, because every hour spent outside of obligation was an hour stolen from something more essential. Maria's fellow students, most of them younger, most of them without dependents, most of them living in the particular freedom of early adulthood, respected her with the quiet, slightly awed respect that people extend to someone whose commitment makes their own look modest. She didn't perform the sacrifice. She just did the work. Every day, without an audience, without a partner to share the weight, without any safety net beyond her own refusal to fall. She specialized in rare diseases. This matters enormously, and not only because of what comes later, it matters because of where it came from. Her mother's illness had been rare and poorly understood, and physicians who treated her had done so with evident discomfort at the edges of their expertise, ordering tests whose results they couldn't fully interpret, consulting specialists who never seemed to have enough time, treating Maria's mother as a complicated problem rather than a complicated person. That experience had left Maria with a specific and burning conviction that the patients who needed the most were consistently receiving the least, not from malice, but from particular institutional bias toward tractable cases and measurable outcomes. She was going to be the physician who went toward the difficult ones, who learned the protocols nobody else wanted to learn, who sat with uncertainty and complexity in the cases that other physicians sent upstairs with a note that said beyond our current scope and translated that as someone else's problem. Rare diseases were not going to be someone else's problem. Not on her watch. Dr. Maria White. She had quietly resumed her maiden name the year Oliver started middle school, graduated from her residency with a reputation that had preceded her to every department she rotated through. She was not flashy. She was not the kind of physician who dominated grand rounds with theatrical diagnostic reasoning. She was the kind who stayed late, who read the most recent literature before every difficult case, who called patients back personally and remembered the details of their lives beyond their charts. Memphis General came to know her the way institutions come to know their most reliable people. Not with fanfare, but with the particular trust that accumulates when someone shows up completely every single time. She took the cases that came in with the word complicated already attached to them. The ones that arrived with thick folders and uncertain prognosis, and families sitting in waiting rooms with a specific, exhausted fear of people who have been told several times that answers are forthcoming and have stopped fully believing it. Maria was their answer. It had cost her everything to become it, and she did not regret a single hour. Oliver, now 15, was his mother's son in every way that could be measured and several that couldn't. Quiet where Maria was measured. Observant in a way that occasionally made adults uncomfortable, because he noticed things they had not intended to reveal. He did well in school, without making much of it, the way self-possessed teenagers do when they've been raised by a parent whose standards are not about performance, but about character. He knew his father existed. Maria had never hidden that fact, never poisoned it either. She spoke of Jack with the careful neutrality of a woman who has processed her own grief completely enough that she can present the facts without loading them with her own emotion. Jack had left. Jack lived in Memphis. Jack had made choices that took him away from them. These were facts, not verdicts, and Oliver held him the way he held most difficult things. Quietly, in a part of himself he hadn't yet found the full language for. He had questions. He was not yet sure he wanted the answers. He would not have that choice for much longer. And then the phone rang at University Hospital on a Wednesday morning, and the name on the incoming case file stopped Maria White's administrative assistant mid-sentence, and she knocked on Maria's office door with a particular knock of someone delivering information they don't know how to package. Maria was reviewing a treatment protocol. When she looked up, her assistant said the name. Jack Brooks, rare aggressive disease. Admitted last night. Assigned to her unit. No other specialist in the system with her specific combination of relevant expertise. She was the attending physician of record. The silence in that office lasted for seconds. Maria looked at the file. She looked at the name. She looked at the diagnosis. And even in the shock of the moment, the physician in her was already moving, already cross-referencing symptom clusters and treatment variables, already doing what she had trained herself for 15 years to do in the presence of a rare and serious case, because the training doesn't stop for the personal, not when it's built as deep as hers was. She closed the folder. She stood up. She told her assistant to prepare the ICU briefing. She walked to the bathroom at the end of the corridor, ran cold water over her wrists, looked at herself in the mirror for 20 seconds, and then walked to the ICU with a composed, deliberate stride of physician who has walked into difficult rooms 1,000 times and is walking into one more. She pushed open the door. The monitors beat their steady and different rhythm. The lights were the same fluorescent lights she had walked under every day for years. And in the bed, pale and diminished in a way that 15 years had not prepared her to see, was Jack Brooks, the man who had stood in their kitchen and ended their life together with a conversation so insufficient she'd stared at the wall for an hour afterward. He looked small. He looked frightened. He looked, for the first time in the entire history of her knowing him, like a man who had run out of road and knew it. He lifted his eyes when she entered, and the recognition, when it landed, moved through his face like something breaking open. Shock first, then something so complicated and so immediate that it bypassed every defense he had left and arrived fully formed as what it actually was. Grief. Real grief. The kind you feel when you see clearly, possibly for the first time, the full dimension of what you destroyed. Maria stood at the foot of his bed, clipboard in hand, and looked at the man who had once been her husband and was now her patient. She did not smile. She did not fracture. She was Dr. Maria White, and this was her unit, and the person in his bed needed the best she had, and she was going to give it to him, not because he had earned it, but because she had. Because 15 years of building something extraordinary out of the worst thing that ever happened to her had not made her smaller. It had made her the kind of physician who does not get to choose who deserves her best. She gives it anyway. That is the whole point. But ask yourself the question that is sitting in that room with both of them right now, the one that neither of them has said aloud. What does it do to a person, to the inside of them, to the carefully rebuilt architecture of everything they become, when the universe places them in the same room as the wound that made them and asks them to heal it? Maria White is about to find out. And so, is everyone who thought they knew how this story was going to go. Here is the question that walked into that hospital room with Maria White and never left. Can a person who was built by someone else's worst decision extend grace to the person who made it? And if they can, does that grace belong to the one receiving it, or does it belong entirely to the one giving it? Sit with that, because the answer to that question is the whole story. Everything that came before was just a road to this room, this bed, this moment. And what happens next is not what Jack Brooks deserves. It is something considerably more significant than that. Maria stood at the foot of his bed for a long moment that she would never fully describe to anyone afterward, not even Oliver, not even herself in the quiet of her own mind late at night when the hospital had gone still and she had the space to revisit it. She stood there and she felt, in the space of approximately 10 seconds, the full unabridged history of what this man had cost her, not the clean, summarized version she had learned over 15 years to carry without letting it show. The real version. The kitchen wall. The 11 weeks on Denise's fold-out couch. The parent-teacher forums with the second emergency contact line. The 2 in the morning flashcard sessions with a sleeping house around her. The medical school rejection letter she had read alone in her car, and then refold and put in the glove compartment like a receipt she might need later. She felt all of it in 10 seconds, fully and without editing. And then she set aside. Not away, not gone, just aside. And she became what she had spent 15 years becoming, completely and without reservation. She was his physician. And she was going to be the best one he had ever had. Jack watched her move through the clinical opening of his examination with particular helplessness of a man whose entire identity has been built on being the most capable person in every room he enters, now completely dependent on someone else's expertise for the continuation of his own life. He watched her hands, steady, efficient, precise, and he thought about Oliver, not yet in this room, but somewhere in the building, brought by a family friend who hadn't known what else to do. He thought about the kitchen. He thought about all the Tuesday mornings he'd been in his office while this woman was in a classroom, a library, a hospital corridor, building something he had never once paused to imagine her capable of. That failure of imagination felt, right now, like its own particular category of loss. Maria completed the initial assessment. She noted her findings in his chart with the focused economy of a physician who does not waste motion, and then she did something that cost her more than any clinical procedure in the room. She looked up from the chart, and she looked at him directly as a human being, and not only as a patient. And she said quietly, "Jack, I need you to understand something. What happens in this room is going to be governed by medicine and by my oath, not by our history. Do you understand that?" He nodded. His throat worked. He said yes. She said good. And she walked out to begin building the protocol that would determine whether he lived or died. And she did not look back, because looking back has never been how Maria White moves through the world. What she did not know yet, what Jack's attorney had handled quietly the previous morning, before the ambulance, in the specific clarity of a man who has stopped pretending he has unlimited time, was that Jack had already made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind designed to be witnessed or rewarded. The kind that comes from a person who has finally understood, at the molecular level, the difference between a gesture and an action. His remaining estate, not the empire of his peak years, but not nothing either, had been quietly restructured. A substantial, unconditional endowment directed to the Rare Disease Research Initiative at University Hospital that bore Dr. Maria White's name in the proposal documents. Secured, irrevocable, requiring nothing from her in return. Oliver's education, from undergraduate through any postgraduate path he chose, funded completely and released into a trust that would deliver regardless of what happened in this hospital room. Jack had signed the documents with the shaking hands of a sick man and the steady intention of someone who has, at considerable personal cost and considerable personal lateness, finally understood what accountability actually looks like when it isn't performing for an audience. Maria found out about the endowment on a Thursday morning from the hospital's development office, who called her with the kind of delighted professional energy that development offices deploy when significant funding arrives, completely unaware of the personal architecture beneath it. She sat with the information for a long time after she hung up. She was not immediately moved. She was something more complicated than moved. She was a woman recalibrating, taking a thing she had been holding in one hand and turning it slowly to see its other faces. It was not an apology. It was not a negotiation. It was not a transaction designed to purchase her forgiveness or her warmth or her reduced vigilance about his care. It was simply what was owed, delivered without fanfare and without terms. That specificity, the absence of conditions, was what finally got through. Not the money, the absence of conditions. She put the phone down. She looked out her office window at the Memphis skyline. She thought about her mother. She thought about Oliver. And she allowed herself, just briefly, the private acknowledgement that the man in room 417 had finally, in the most insufficient and most genuine way simultaneously, done something right. Oliver came to the hospital on a Saturday. Maria had told him only what was necessary, that his father was ill, that he was being treated here, that Oliver did not have to go in if he wasn't ready, and that whatever he felt about was correct and did not require permission or editing. Oliver had listened with the focused stillness he'd inherited from her, and then he had asked one question. Is it going to be okay? Maria had answered as a physician and as a mother simultaneously, which is to say she had been honest without being clinical. She said they were working on it, that she was doing everything available, and that she would not stop until they had exhausted every option. Oliver had nodded in the way he nodded when he was filing something important. He said he wanted to go in. The scene in room 417 when Oliver entered was not the kind that announces itself dramatically. It was quiet in the way that the most significant scenes are almost always quiet. Two people in a room, one of them carrying 15 years of unanswered questions, and the other carrying 15 years of undelivered answers, and neither of them entirely sure how to begin. Oliver stood near the door. Jack looked at him with an expression that had no precedent in his experience, because he had never before been in the presence of the direct, living consequence of his worst choice, looking at it with his mother's eyes and a face that was undeniably and heartbreakingly also his. He did not try to be charming. He did not reach for the executive instinct to frame and manage the narrative. He was too tired and too honest and too close to the edge of everything for any of that. He just looked at his son and said, "You look like your mother. That's the best thing I can tell you about yourself." Oliver sat down. Not close. Not across the room either. Somewhere in the middle distance of a young man who is deciding in real time how much of himself to offer to a situation he did not choose. He asked his questions, the ones he had carried since he was old enough to understand that fathers are supposed to stay. He asked them plainly, without cruelty but without softening either, because Oliver White had been raised by a woman who believed that honest questions deserve honest answers, and that protecting people from the truth of their own actions is not kindness. Jack answered every one. He did not reframe. He did not contextualize. He said, "I was selfish. I told myself things that weren't true, so I could do what I wanted to do. You deserved a father who stayed. I didn't stay. I don't have an explanation that makes that right." Oliver listened. He nodded slowly. He didn't weep and he didn't rage. Because Oliver White had been raised in the specific emotional literacy of a household where feelings were acknowledged and processed rather than performed. He sat with what Jack had said for a while. And then he said quietly, "I'm not ready to call you Dad, but I came. That has to mean something." Jack said, "It means everything." And he meant it in the way that only people who have lost everything superfluous can mean something completely, without remainder. Maria's treatment protocol was extraordinary, not because it was experimental, though it was drawing on the most current research in a field she had spent 15 years building expertise in, synthesizing approaches from 3 different institutional studies and 1 unpublished European trial she had been following for 2 years. It was extraordinary because it was designed with particular care of a physician who had looked at the specific patient's file, the specific constellation of symptoms and markers in history, and had built a response calibrated entirely to him, not to the category of his disease, but to the individual human being in room 417. This is what Maria White did for every patient. She did not do less for this one because of who he was. She would not have known how to. The person who had spent 15 years becoming Dr. Maria White had not built a self that contained that particular diminishment. She was incapable of it. And if you are looking for the truest measure of what she had become, not despite Jack, but through the process that Jack's abandonment had set in motion, it is right there, in the protocol, in the care, in the absolute refusal to let what was personal contaminate what was professional, not because she had no feelings, but because she had too much integrity to let her feelings make a patient of hers receive anything less than everything she had. Jack began to respond to treatment in the 3rd week. Slowly, cautiously. The disease was not defeated, not in the clean narrative sense, because real medicine does not operate in clean narrative arcs. But the markers moved. The numbers shifted in the direction that mattered. The team gathered around his updated charts with the particular quiet excitement of physicians who had been watching a difficult case move towards something other than its worst projection.